As Julian mentioned, I do want to focus on Iraq's policy towards Syria, but also the threat perceived by Shia communities across the Middle East from the ongoing civil and sectarian conflict there. And some people argue there's really no difference between Iraq and the Shia, given that the Shia Islamists dominate and will continue to dominate, at least for the foreseeable future, the politics in Baghdad. I think when speaking of Shia communities, it's important to bear in mind that they are just that, communities in a plural sense. The Shia were never and are not a monolithic bloc. On Syria, there is no united position, and politicians differ on what stance to take with regards to Syria. And even the clerical establishments in Najaf and in Iraq and in Iran have different policies. So the clerical establishment in Najaf, which is led by Ayatollah Sistani, arguably the most influential Shia cleric, discourages Iraqi youth from traveling to fight in Syria. And this is obviously in stark contrast with not just Iran's position, but Iraq's position, the position by the Iraqi government in Baghdad. The point I would make, however, is that the danger and threat faced by the Shia from the conflict in Syria, both real and perceived, are largely shared, even though the responses to this threat isn't unified. In terms of thinking what are the interests, what are the concerns, what are the fears, I've broken them down into four main points, which I'll briefly talk about each one. The first, of course, is the spillover conflict in Iraq, in Lebanon, especially. And of course, the spillover conflict is a threat for everyone, for Saudi, for Jordan, for Turkey. But Iraq and Lebanon are, the Saudis, Turks, and Jordanians are in a better position to confront this threat than are Iraq and Lebanon. So and this empowers local insurgents. So it has obvious national security threats and concerns, which have an added sectarian dimension given the groups that are involved in Syria. Number two, there is a really strong perception throughout Baghdad, when you talk to Shia politicians from different parties, that there is a regional attempt to undermine or reverse the Shia ascendancy that we witnessed since the 2003 Iraq War. Number three, the growing influence and power of extremist Salafi jihadi groups. And this is, there's various groups that fit into this definition. It includes the official Al-Qaeda franchise, which other panelists have spoken about, Jabhat al-Nusra, but also the non-Al-Qaeda Islamist groups, the most powerful of which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, ISIS or ISIL or Daesh. And of course, there are also non-Al-Qaeda extremist Salafi jihadists, which are very obviously supported by Saudi Arabia and Syria, the Ahrar al-Sham, the Islamic Front, and the Jaish al-Islam. All these groups pose a threat to Iraq and the Shia, more generally speaking. And number four is the threat posed to the Sayyidah Zainab Shrine in Damascus, which I don't think receives enough attention, and real fears of a repeat Samarra attack that we saw in Iraq in 2006, which unleashed horrific waves of sectarian retaliations and tit-for-tat killings. And on that fourth point, I would just say there is a religious dimension and symbolism here that is important. We can discuss politics all day, but there are important religious aspects we are in danger of ignoring. I'm deliberately here not focusing on Iran. Their geopolitical interests in Syria are well known, and I'm doing this deliberately because the point I want to make is that for many Shia, this conflict goes beyond Iran and Iranian interests. In other words, many Shia Arabs see the conflict in Syria as a threat regardless of Iran and its strategic interests. So Iraq's position on Syria, which publicly is neutrality, but in private they're supporting the Assad regime, this reflects its own strategic and political calculations, not obedience to Iran. So even the Shia rivals of Iraq's Prime Minister Maliki see the conflict in a similar light. So Bayan Jabr, who's a leading figure of the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, and he actually sees himself as a potential prime minister. Last month said Iraq and Syria, and these are important words. He said Iraq and Syria have a common fate and a common enemy. And he used very strong language when describing the scenario if Syrian President Bashar al-Assad falls, saying that it will open the gates of hell and the battle will reach the gates of Baghdad. He went on to say that if the Syrian regime falls, God forbid, those are his words, Baghdad may not be strong enough to confront the terrorist campaign it would face as a result of this. The threat perceived by Iraqi Shia politicians coming from Syria is made even clearer when we take into account that only a few years ago, these same politicians who are today siding with Assad were blaming Syria for terrorism in Iraq. So Bayan Jabbar, who uses the words God forbid when talking about the fall of Assad, even now admits that Syria itself was, and I quote, a gateway of evil for Iraq during the sectarian and civil war Iraq had. So Baghdad, which today provides assistance to the Assad regime and turns a blind eye at best to the thousands of Shia militia fighters who travel to Syria, once publicly blamed Syria for 50% of the terrorism in Iraq. Of course, it goes without saying that Iraqi Sunni politicians see this conflict in a very different light, sensing an opportunity to weaken their domestic rivals if the rebels win in Syria. So they speak of the creation of a Sunni crescent on Iraq's western bank, which is Anbar, currently also witnessing an insurgency. And in equally strong and emotive language, argue that Western Iraq should be turned into a shield for Syria, and that Iraq Sunnis should complete what our brothers have started in Syria. So the calls for jihad in Syria from various clerics also mobilizes the other side to act. Given that the main regional Sunni powers in the Middle East, namely Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, support both the opposition in Syria and Maliki's opposition in Iraq, it helps cement the fear in Baghdad that the conflict in Syria and Iraq is really just part of one conflict that's aimed at reversing the Shia ascendancy in the Middle East. So they see the lines increasingly blurred between Iraq and Syria. So Maliki on Saudi Arabia and Qatar was very explicit recently when he said, and I quote, "They are attacking Iraq through Syria and in a direct way, and they declared war on Iraq as they declared it on Syria. And unfortunately, it is on a sectarian and political basis." Also, Maliki a couple of months ago told the German newspaper, and again I'm quoting, "There are two main axes here in the Middle East, Sunni and Shia. A few Persian Gulf countries and Turkey are behind the first one, while the second one is the Iranian Arab axis, which extends across Iraq and Syria and into Lebanon. 4 or 5 years ago, we told the United States that Turkey and a few Gulf countries were trying to destroy the Shia axis." So the Iraqi Prime Minister, like many other politicians and even observers, sees the current conflict in terms of a black and white Cold War or new Cold War. Finally, the religious aspect. So the Shia militia fighters are present in their thousands. It's difficult to give an accurate number, and numbers range from 3,000 to 5,000, who are there fighting across Syria, alongside Assad, against his opposition. The fighters in Iraq were initially based in and around the Sayyidah Zainab Shrine in Damascus, which is a sacred Shia shrine and pilgrimage site for millions of Shia across the world. It has been and remains the most powerful rallying call for these fighters from various nationalities to defend Shia interests, not necessarily to protect Bashar al-Assad. And I'll come to that in a second. Now, however, the Shia militias are increasingly being deployed across various parts of Syria, but those battles are, for the fighters themselves, part of the same goal of defending Sayyidah Zainab and preventing it from falling into the hands of extremist Salafi jihadis, who in Syria have destroyed and demolished many mosques and churches, and even heritage sites. In one of the videos produced by the main Shia militia force fighting in Syria, besides Hezbollah, the main Shia militia force from Iraq, Asab Ahl al-Haq, they made it clear, and this is in the lyrics of the song, to the backdrop of fighters, waving their guns. And I'm quoting here, "We are not here for Bashar, our concern is the Shia." So this is significant to bear in mind, because although Iran provides the logistical and financial means for these fighters to be in Syria, to help Tehran provide crucial support for Assad, for the fighters themselves, it is less about Iranian geopolitical interests and more about defending their own community, religious symbols, and sacred sites. Another aspect of the conflict that feeds into these fears is the increasingly messianic and apocalyptic dimensions of the conflict. For both the Sunnis and Shia, as well as many Christians, Syria plays a central role in the end of times scenarios, according to prophetic and other Islamic traditions. So Bilad al-Sham, where Syria is today, is seen as the main battleground that will pave the way for the return of the Messiah and Jesus. So for many people, the people with the guns on the ground, this has now become a conflict that is a prelude to nothing less than the end of the world and Armageddon itself. And I think I'll conclude on that somewhat bleak notes.